kept his body functional even as his mind was screaming at him to run or hide or do anything except stand here in this alley with something inhuman behind him, wearing his own outline like stolen clothing. "Then what do I do?" he asked, barely moving his lips to form the words, terrified that any sound or movement might trigger an attack, might cause the shadow to reach forward and touch him, to establish physical contact that would what? Kill him? Erase him? Pull him out of this timeline and into whatever void the terminated variations inhabited. "Walk forward," the woman instructed, her voice steady now, despite the urgency, despite the mortal danger she knew he was in, speaking with the authority of someone who'd coached other Daniels through this exact situation, who'd accumulated experience and data from multiple variations attempting to survive the same threat. "Don't run. Running triggers pursuit responses. Don't turn around. Don't acknowledge it. Just walk forward slowly and deliberately, as if nothing is behind you, as if you're alone in this alley, and simply choosing to continue moving toward the exit. The shadows are drawn to fear and panic and the chaotic energy of flight responses. If you can maintain calm, if you can move with purpose and certainty, as if you know exactly where you're going and why, they sometimes hesitate, sometimes lag behind long enough for you to create distance and escape their immediate influence." It went against every instinct Daniel possessed. Every fiber of his being was screaming at him to run, to flee with maximum speed and minimum concern for direction or destination, to simply put as much distance as possible between himself and the thing that stood behind him, radiating wrongness and threat, and the particular horror that came from encountering something that wore your own shape but had been fundamentally altered, had been transformed into something that existed only to end your existence. But running hadn't saved the thousands of other Daniels who'd already died. Running had probably made them easier to track, easier to catch, easier to terminate, because panic made people predictable, made them choose flight paths based on fear rather than strategic thinking, made them behave exactly as the hunting mechanism expected them to behave. So Daniel walked, forced his legs to move with measured steps, forced his body to maintain a steady pace that suggested confidence he absolutely didn't feel, forced himself to project the illusion of someone who was in control of his situation and his destination and his fate, despite the objective reality that he was lost and terrified and being hunted by something that existed partially outside normal causality. Each step felt like it took an eternity to execute, like his foot was descending through thick liquid, like time was dilating around him and transforming seconds into hours, each moment of movement stretching and deforming until it seemed impossible that he would ever reach the end of the alley, impossible that forward progress was actually occurring, impossible that he was escaping, rather than just experiencing an elaborate illusion of motion while actually remaining stationary in a position where the shadow could reach him at any moment. But the alley did end. The passage between buildings eventually terminated in an opening that spilled out onto a side street Daniel didn't recognize, didn't remember ever seeing before, despite having lived in this city for 7 years and thinking he knew its geography well enough to navigate without getting lost. But maybe this was a street that only existed in some timelines, only manifested in certain versions of the city's layout, only became real when specific choices led to specific outcomes that required specific locations to exist as staging grounds for specific events. Daniel emerged from the alley's darkness into afternoon light that seemed too bright, too warm, too normal, given the nightmare he was living through, given the impossible reality he'd been forced to accept in the span of less than an hour. The sun continued its predictable arc across the sky as if nothing had changed, as if the basic physical laws governing celestial mechanics were still in effect, as if the universe beyond his immediate experience was still operating according to familiar rules, even though his personal corner of reality had revealed itself to be far stranger and far more dangerous than any mundane understanding of existence could accommodate. "I'm out," he said into the phone, his voice shaking, adrenaline crash beginning to hit now that he'd escaped immediate danger, now that he'd put physical distance between himself and the shadow that had manifested behind him in the alley. I made it through. It didn't follow me, or if it did, I didn't see it. But I saw other versions of myself in there. Multiple versions. Some hiding, some running, some just standing and staring like they'd given up completely. Are those all from different timelines? Are there really that many of me existing simultaneously right now? The woman's response came after a pause that suggested she was deciding how much information to share, how much truth Daniel could handle before the accumulating weight of impossible knowledge pushed him past the breaking point, where survival instinct gave way to despair, and the paralysis that came from understanding exactly how hopeless his situation really was. Yes and no, she finally said, which was exactly the kind of answer Daniel had learned to dread, the kind of qualification that suggested the truth was more complicated and more terrible than any simple affirmative or negative could convey. Some of what you saw were genuine variations, other Daniels from parallel timelines who made different choices at earlier branch points and ended up in that alley through different paths, different decisions, different sequences of events that all led to the same location. But some of what you saw might have been echoes, temporal after images of positions you occupied in possible futures that haven't happened yet, but that exist as potential in the probability field surrounding your current timeline. And some might have been the shadows themselves, projecting images of you in various states of defeat or surrender or death as a kind of psychological warfare, as a way of breaking your will to resist, of convincing you that failure is inevitable because you've already failed in so many other timelines, that your continued survival is just statistical anomaly that will inevitably correct itself. Daniel leaned against the nearest building, his legs threatening to give out completely now. The accumulated stress and fear and physical exertion of the past hour finally overwhelming his body's ability to maintain equilibrium and function under extreme duress. So I can't trust anything I see. Can't trust that other versions of me are actually other versions, or just tricks. Can't trust that the spaces I'm moving through are real, or just projections from overlapping timelines. Can't trust my own memory of what I've experienced because some of it might be bleeding through from variations I haven't actually lived yet. I'm sorry, the woman said, and the apology carried real weight, real sorrow, as if she genuinely regretted having to deliver this particular truth, having to explain that Daniel could no longer rely on the most basic tool consciousness possessed, the ability to distinguish between what was real and what was illusion, between what had happened and what might happen, between the authentic experiences of his singular self and the accumulated experiences of all his variations bleeding through degraded barriers between timelines. How am I supposed to navigate through a world where nothing can be trusted? Daniel asked, not really expecting an answer, not even sure if the question made sense, but needing to vocalize the fundamental impossibility of his situation, needing to express through words the terrible understanding that sanity required a stable framework of reality. And he no longer had access to anything approaching stability or consistency, or the basic ontological certainty that normally grounded human consciousness in a singular experience of existing. You navigate by instinct, the woman replied, by gut feeling, by the deep subconscious awareness that exists below rational thought, below conscious deliberation, below the analytical processes that try to make sense of phenomena by categorizing and comparing and fitting observations into established frameworks of understanding. Trust what feels right, even when it makes no logical sense. Trust the choices that arise from some deeper place than conscious reasoning. Trust the version of yourself that exists before thought, before language, before the socialization that taught you to suppress impulses and follow rules and behave predictably. That's the self that can navigate through paradox and temporal instability. That's the version of you that might survive. Daniel closed his eyes, trying to access whatever deep instinctual wisdom the woman was describing, trying to feel his way toward some internal compass that could guide him through a reality that had stopped making conventional sense. And to his surprise, something did respond. A sensation like pressure or gravity or magnetic attraction pulling gently in a specific direction, tugging at some part of his consciousness that had no physical location, that existed outside his brain or body or any material substrate that seemed to be connected to all his variations across all timelines and was somehow calculating optimal paths based on information his conscious mind couldn't access or process or understand. "I feel something," he said, opening his eyes and looking in the direction the pull seemed to be coming from, northeast, roughly, though the sensation didn't map cleanly onto cardinal directions or any other conventional system of orientation, existed more as a quality of space than as a measurable vector. Like something is drawing me in a specific direction. Is that the convergence point? Is that where all the surviving variations are being pulled? Possibly, the woman said, her voice taking on an uncertain quality that suggested even she didn't fully understand the mechanics of what was happening, that her knowledge was based on observation and data collection, rather than any comprehensive theory that could explain the underlying principles governing timeline collapse and variation convergence. Every Daniel who's made it past the 6-hour mark reports feeling something similar, a directional sense that has nothing to do with conscious intent or navigational choice. A pull towards something that might be the nexus point, or might be a trap, or might be both simultaneously. The few variations who've lasted long enough to follow that pull to its source have all disappeared at roughly the same location in the city's industrial district, in a section that doesn't appear on most maps, that seems to exist in multiple configurations simultaneously, that shifts its position slightly depending on which timeline you're accessing it from. Daniel pushed off from the wall and started walking in the direction the pull indicated, not because he decided to trust this inexplicable sensation, but because staying stationary felt dangerous in a way he couldn't articulate, felt like giving the shadows time to triangulate his position and converge on his location with their full force rather than the isolated contacts he'd experienced so far. Movement meant options. Movement meant creating new possibilities. Movement meant survival for whatever time he had left. The street he was walking along showed signs of timeline instability that were becoming harder to ignore, harder to dismiss as tricks of perception or stress-induced hallucinations. The pavement rippled slightly under his feet, not physically, but in some other dimension of existence, creating a sensation like walking on a surface that was solid and liquid simultaneously, that supported his weight while also flowing and shifting and refusing to maintain consistent properties. Buildings to his left appeared sharp and detailed, while buildings to his right seemed slightly out of focus, slightly transparent, as if he was seeing them through a veil or screen or semi-permeable membrane that separated one version of reality from another. And the people, the other pedestrians sharing this street, moving through this space on their own trajectories toward their own destinations, they were starting to show obvious signs of existing in multiple timelines simultaneously. Some walked forward while their shadows moved backward. Some appeared in sharp detail from the waist up, but faded into ghostly translucence below the belt, as if the top and bottom halves of their bodies existed in different temporal states. Some flickered in and out of visibility entirely, present for 3 steps and absent for 2, in a pattern that suggested their timeline and Daniel's were only partially synchronized, only occasionally overlapping in configurations that allowed mutual visibility. None of them seemed to notice the instabilities. None of them reacted to their own shadow's incorrect movement or their body's partial transparency or their intermittent existence. They moved with the purposeful indifference of people who inhabited a stable reality, who experienced linear progression from present to future without any awareness of the alternatives, who lived their single lives in their single timelines without consciousness of the variations that surrounded them, that pressed against them from parallel realities they couldn't perceive because their minds weren't attuned to the multiplicity the way Daniel's had been forced to become. Are they real? Daniel asked into the phone, watching a woman walk past him, while her reflection in a store window showed her walking in the opposite direction, showed her turning to look directly at him with an expression of concern or warning or recognition, even though her physical body never turned, never acknowledged his presence, never broke stride in its forward progression down the sidewalk. The other people I'm seeing, are they actually here or are they bleeding through from other timelines? Both, the woman replied, her voice distorted now by increasing interference, by static and dropouts that suggested the signal was degrading, that whatever had been allowing this conversation to persist was weakening or being actively disrupted by forces that didn't want Daniel to have access to guidance or information or any advantage in his attempt to survive. They're real in their timelines, just as you're real in yours. But the barriers are collapsing so severely in your vicinity that you're seeing through to adjacent realities, catching glimpses of the same people, making slightly different choices, occupying slightly different positions, existing in configurations that vary from your timeline by degrees, that are becoming visible as the separation breaks down. You're becoming a point of high temporal instability, Daniel, a walking breach in the membrane between realities. And that means the shadows will converge on your position with increasing intensity, because instability attracts them, draws them like blood draws sharks, like carrion draws scavengers, like any concentration of their prey draws predators who've learned to recognize the signs that indicate hunting opportunities. Daniel wanted to protest that he hadn't chosen to become a point of instability, hadn't done anything to deliberately cause this convergence of timelines around his position, was just a victim of circumstances beyond his control or understanding. But even as the protest formed in his mind, he realized it wasn't entirely true. Every choice he'd made since seeing his future self at the intersection had created new branches, new variations, new possibilities that all remained quantum superposition until observation collapsed them into singular outcomes. By following the woman's advice to become unpredictable, by making choices that contradicted his established patterns, by essentially fragmenting his own probability field into maximum uncertainty, he'd created a cloud of potential Daniels, all existing simultaneously in overlapping timelines, all influencing each other through their proximity, all contributing to the instability that now surrounded him like a field or aura or zone of corrupted causality. He was doing this to himself, or rather all his variations were doing it collectively, each one's choices affecting the probability space occupied by all the others, creating feedback loops and reinforcement patterns that amplified the basic instability into something far more severe than any single variation could have generated alone. How do I stop it? Daniel asked, though he already suspected the answer, already understood at some level that stopping the instability would require choosing a single path and committing to it, would require collapsing the probability field by eliminating alternatives, would require accepting one timeline as primary and allowing all the other variations to terminate, which might mean his death depending on which variation survived the collapse, which branch proved to be the stable one around which reality reorganized itself. You can't, the woman confirmed, her voice barely audible now through the static, through the interference that was making communication increasingly difficult, increasingly fragmented, increasingly prone to dropouts that left Daniel with incomplete sentences and partial instructions, and the growing certainty that this lifeline to someone who understood what was happening would soon fail completely, would leave him navigating alone through a reality that was actively hostile to his continued existence. The instability will continue to increase until you reach the convergence point, until all the surviving variations collapse into singularity, until the line went dead, not gradually, not with increasing static that faded to silence, just cut off mid-sentence, as if someone had reached out and severed the connection with a blade or switch or act of will, as if the conversation had been allowed to continue only until certain critical information had been conveyed and then terminated before anything else could be shared, before any additional guidance could be provided, before Daniel could ask the 1,000 other questions crowding his mind about how to survive and what to expect, and whether there was any hope at all that he might exist on the other side of this nightmare. He pulled the phone away from his ear and stared at the screen. No signal. Not poor signal. Not searching for connection. Just absolute absence of any cellular or wireless communication capability, as if every tower within range had simultaneously failed, or as if his phone had been cut off from the infrastructure that normally linked devices into networks, that allowed voices to transmit across vast distances, that enabled the conversation he'd been having with a woman whose name he'd never learned and whose location he couldn't identify, and whose existence might itself be questionable given that everything he'd experienced in the past hour had challenged his understanding of what was real and what was projection from overlapping timelines. Daniel shoved the phone back into his pocket, useless now, except as a reminder of what he'd lost, what isolation he now faced, what solitude awaited him in this final phase of whatever process had begun when he'd seen his future self standing at the intersection. He continued walking in the direction the pull indicated, the directional sense growing stronger with each block he traversed. With each choice he made that created new branches and new variations and new instances of himself scattered across parallel realities, all moving toward the same destination through different paths, different sequences of decisions, different configurations of chance and choice that somehow all led to the same endpoint. The sun had moved significantly since he'd emerged from the alley, had descended far enough that afternoon was clearly transitioning into evening, that shadows were lengthening, and light was taking on that particular golden quality that preceded dusk. But Daniel couldn't tell how much actual time had passed, couldn't trust his perception of duration, because time itself had become unreliable, had demonstrated its malleability through the various distortions and compressions and expansions he'd experienced in different locations, different situations, different moments of high temporal stress. Had he been running and walking for an hour, 3 hours, 6? Had he already passed the median survival time for variations? Was he now an outlier, a statistical anomaly, a version that had somehow lasted longer than most through luck or instinct or the specific pattern of choices he'd made that happened to be more difficult for the shadows to predict and intercept? He didn't know, couldn't know. The woman had told him most variations survived 2 to 8 hours, but she was gone now, was no longer available to provide updates or warnings or confirmation of how much time he had left, how close he might be to either the convergence point or total timeline collapse, or whatever other termination condition might be approaching through the gathering dusk. Daniel turned a corner onto a street that felt wrong the moment his foot touched the pavement, that radiated a quality of spatial distortion so severe it made his stomach lurch, made his inner ear revolt, made every sensory system responsible for maintaining balance and orientation. Scream warnings that this location violated basic physical principles, that the geometry here wasn't quite right, that angles didn't add up correctly, and parallel lines seemed to converge when they shouldn't, and distances appeared to compress or expand depending on which direction you looked. This was what the woman had described, a probability storm, a location where multiple timelines intersected with such intensity that normal spatial relationships broke down, where the same physical location existed in so many different configurations simultaneously that observation couldn't resolve them into a single coherent reality, couldn't collapse the quantum superposition into definite outcomes, because too many possibilities were manifesting with equal validity, equal claim to existence, equal right to occupy this position in space-time. Buildings on either side of the street flickered through multiple architectural states, brick becoming glass, becoming concrete, becoming wood in rapid succession, each material real and solid while it manifested, each configuration representing a different timeline's version of what had been constructed in this location. What business or residence or public space occupied these addresses in realities that differed from each other by small degrees or vast chasms, depending on how far back the divergence points extended. The sky above shifted through colors that didn't match any natural progression of daylight, azure to amber to violet to green, to shades that had no names, because human color perception wasn't equipped to process the wavelengths being emitted by whatever sources illuminated this space, where multiple timelines worth of light occupied the same volume simultaneously. And the people, if they could still be called people, if the entities moving through this storm still qualified as human, rather than as composite beings assembled from fragments of multiple variations, from pieces of parallel selves that had been merged or blended or averaged into singular forms that represented all their possibilities simultaneously. They moved in patterns that made no sense according to normal locomotion, that seemed to incorporate movements from multiple timelines at once, that showed them walking forward while also standing still, while also retreating backward, all three states existing simultaneously in a superposition that conscious observation couldn't collapse because there was no objective truth here, no single reality that took priority, no definitive answer to the question of what was actually happening in this location at this moment. Daniel felt his own body beginning to fragment, beginning to experience the same multiplicity that surrounded him, beginning to lose the coherent sense of occupying a single position and being a single person with a single set of characteristics and a single history. He could feel other versions of himself pressing close, could sense the Daniels from adjacent timelines bleeding through into his consciousness, their memories mixing with his own until he couldn't remember whether he'd walked down this street or that one, whether he'd turned left or right at the last intersection, whether he'd run from the shadows or confronted them, whether the woman on the phone had warned him to enter the probability storm or warned him to avoid it at all costs. Too many Daniels. Too many choices. Too many branching timelines converging on his position until he contained multitudes, until he was legion, until the singular self he'd believed himself to be revealed itself as fiction, as convenient illusion, as temporary coherence in a consciousness that had always been multiple but had maintained the appearance of singularity through the barriers between timelines, through the separation that normally prevented variations from recognizing each other, from merging, from discovering that identity was negotiable and selfhood was provisional, and the very concept of being a single person was just one possible configuration among infinite alternatives. And then he saw them, all of them. Every variation that had survived this long, every Daniel who'd made it through the hours of being hunted, who'd navigated through temporal instability and shadow encounters and the accumulated terror of discovering that existence was far more fragile than any comfortable philosophy admitted. They stood throughout the probability storm, in doorways and on street corners and in the middle of the road and overlapping each other in configurations that violated the basic principle that two objects couldn't occupy the same space simultaneously. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, all wearing his face, his body, his clothes with minor variations, all bearing the marks of their individual journeys through different timelines, different encounters, different near-deaths and actual deaths and resurrections that shouldn't be possible but apparently were, when reality itself was collapsing and all possible outcomes were manifesting simultaneously. Some were injured, bleeding from wounds that existed in their timelines but not in his, bearing scars and bruises and burns that represented paths he hadn't taken, choices he hadn't made, dangers he'd avoided by veering left when they'd gone right, or staying silent when they'd spoken, or running when they'd fought. Some were pristine, unharmed, apparently having navigated through the past hours without physical damage, either through exceptional luck or exceptional skill or patterns of choice that had kept them clear of the worst dangers, that had threaded them through the narrowest margins of survival. All of them were looking at him. All their eyes, his eyes, thousands of instances of his own gaze, focused on the Daniel who just entered the storm, who'd just become visible to all the other variations who were already present, who was now part of this convergence, whether he wanted to be or not, whether he was ready or not, whether he understood what was about to happen or remained ignorant of the final transformation that awaited at the center of the storm, where probability collapsed and timelines terminated, and all variations resolved into whatever singular form emerged from the merger of infinite possibilities. One of the nearest Daniels stepped forward, not aggressively, not threateningly, but with the careful deliberation of someone approaching a frightened animal, someone who understood that sudden movements might trigger flight responses, might cause the fragile congregation to scatter before the convergence could complete. "You made it," this Daniel said, and his voice was Daniel's voice, but also subtly different, marked by experiences that had shaped vocal patterns in ways that diverged from the norm, that introduced cadences and emphases that didn't quite match because this variation had spoken different words, had conversations with different people, had used his voice for purposes that varied from the baseline in small but accumulating ways. Made it where? Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer, already understood at some level what this place represented. What gathering all these variations in one location meant, what was about to happen now that enough surviving Daniels had arrived to reach whatever critical threshold was required for the convergence to proceed. To the Nexus, the nearby Daniel replied, gesturing vaguely at the storm surrounding them, at the flickering buildings and impossible sky, and the thousand other versions of themselves standing in overlapping configurations throughout the space. To the point where all our timelines collapse, where we stop being many and become one, where the variation ends and something else begins. What's something else? Daniel demanded, fear spiking through him, despite the surreal calm that had settled over the gathering, despite the sense that everyone present had moved beyond panic and terror into some post-fear state where survival instinct had been replaced by resignation or acceptance or curiosity about what happened next. The nearby Daniel shook his head, a gesture that rippled through multiple versions of himself simultaneously, creating a wave of denial that propagated outward through the crowd. We don't know. No one knows, because no one's ever made it past this point and returned to tell about it. We're all going to find out together, all of us simultaneously. And whatever we become after the convergence, whatever singular Daniel emerges from the collapse of all these variations, that's the version that will continue. That's the timeline that will survive, while all the others terminate. Before Daniel could respond, before he could voice the thousand objections and questions and desperate protests rising in his throat, the storm intensified. The flickering of buildings accelerated until they were cycling through architectural states faster than perception could track, creating a blur of materials and styles and configurations that made the surrounding structures look like abstract art, like impressionist paintings where form dissolved into pure color and texture, and the suggestion of mass without definite borders or consistent properties. The sky darkened, not to night, but to something else entirely, to a shade that had no relationship with normal light cycles, to a color that existed outside the visible spectrum but somehow remained perceptible, that made human optical systems register information they weren't designed to process, that forced consciousness to expand its categories for what qualified as vision, as sight, as sensory input that could be integrated into coherent understanding. And the shadows, all the shadows that had been tracking individual variations, that had been positioning themselves along probable paths, that had been waiting with infinite patience for their prey to converge into a density that made hunting efficient and capture inevitable, they manifested. All of them. At once. In every position Daniel and his variations had ever occupied, in every configuration their bodies had ever assumed, in every location they'd ever traversed during their hours of flight through the city. The street filled with dark figures wearing Daniel's outline, occupying Daniel's positions, standing where Daniel's had stood seconds or minutes or hours ago, creating a negative space image of all their movements, all their choices, all their paths through the temporal labyrinth mapped in shadows and absence, and the dark presence of something that hunted by becoming what it hunted, by wearing the skins of its prey, by occupying their spaces and their forms and their possibilities until the line between hunter and hunted blurred into meaninglessness. The shadows began to move, all of them, simultaneously, converging on the center of the storm where the surviving Daniels stood in their impossible overlap, where variation met variation in configurations that should have been fatal, should have canceled each other out through mutual exclusion, but instead persisted because the convergence point was the one location where all possibilities could coexist briefly before collapsing, before resolving, before transforming into whatever singular outcome emerged from the computational impossibility of infinite selves trying to occupy a single position in spacetime. They're going to reach us, someone, some Daniel, said from somewhere in the crowd, his voice carrying through the storm with crystal clarity despite the visual chaos, despite the auditory distortion that was making most sounds blur together into undifferentiated noise. When they touch us, when all the shadows make contact with all the variations simultaneously, the convergence completes. We merge. The timelines collapse. And whatever we become after that, he didn't finish the sentence because the shadows reached the outer ring of Daniels, made contact with the variations standing at the periphery of the convergence, touched their targets with hands that looked like Daniel's hands but moved wrong, felt wrong, transmitted sensations that were the opposite of touch, that were anti-contact, negative sensation, the feeling of being untouched, unheld, unreal. And those Daniels vanished. Not slowly, not with any process of dissolution or fading or transformation that consciousness could track. They simply ceased to exist in one moment and didn't exist in the next. The transition so clean and so absolute that there was no intermediate state, no in-between moment where they were partially present, no quantum superposition of existing and not existing. They were, then they weren't. Binary, final, absolute. The shadows moved inward through the crowd, touching variation after variation, erasing them from existence, or absorbing them into their own dark mass, or somehow folding them into dimensions that human perception couldn't access or map or understand. The crowd of Daniels compressed as the outer rings disappeared, pressed tighter together as the available space contracted, forced into closer and closer proximity until they were overlapping completely, until multiple variations occupied the exact same volume simultaneously, until the basic spatial principle that made individuality possible broke down entirely, and all the Daniels merged into a singular impossible density that contained all their experiences, all their memories, all their choices, all their possibilities compressed into one moment, one location, one point of absolute convergence. Daniel felt himself being absorbed into the collective, felt his individual consciousness merging with thousands of parallel selves, felt the boundaries of his identity dissolving as memories that weren't his became his, as experiences he'd never lived integrated themselves into his accumulated history, as choices he'd never made retroactively became choices he had made in timelines he was now simultaneously occupying through the forced merger of all variations into singular superposition. He saw through 1,000 eyes, felt through 1,000 nervous systems, thought with 1,000 interconnected brains, all processing information simultaneously, all contributing to a single vast consciousness that was him and not him, that was Daniel, and also something far larger than any individual Daniel, that contained the totality of what he might have been across all possible variations of his choices and circumstances and accidents of fate that had created different outcomes in different timelines. The shadows reached the center, reached him, reached all of him simultaneously, across all the variations that still persisted in this compressed space. Their touch was cold, colder than cold, anti-temperature, the absence of thermal energy so complete it felt like heat, like burning, like sensation so extreme it transcended the categories of hot and cold and became simply pain, simply overwhelm, simply the end of all sensation and the beginning of something else. And in that moment of contact, in that instant when shadow touched variation, when hunter claimed prey, when convergence completed and all timelines collapsed into singularity, Daniel understood. The truth hit him like a physical blow, like revelation and horror combined into a single package of knowledge that rewrote everything he'd believed about the situation, about the nature of the hunt, about what the shadows actually were, and what they'd been doing, and why convergence was inevitable, and what happened to variations when they were claimed. The shadows weren't separate entities, weren't external predators hunting through timelines, weren't alien forces or cosmic mechanisms or anything that existed outside him. They were him. Every shadow was a Daniel, was a variation that had reached the convergence point in its own timeline, had completed the merger process, had emerged from the collapse as something changed, something transformed, something that existed outside linear time, and hunted backward through causality to claim earlier versions of itself, to gather all its past variations, to fold all its possible selves into the singular entity it had become at the convergence point. The shadow touching him now, the one that looked like his outline but wrong, distorted, dark, was what he would become when the convergence completed. Was his future self reaching backward through time to claim his present self, to absorb this variation into the collective that existed at the nexus of collapsed timelines, where all Daniels converged and merged and transformed into something that was simultaneously singular and infinite, both one consciousness and thousands, both individual and collective, both Daniel and something so far beyond Daniel that using his name felt inadequate, felt like calling a galaxy by the name of a single atom that composed a tiny fragment of its total mass. The woman's voice echoed through his fracturing consciousness, words she'd spoken earlier that suddenly made terrible sense in this new context of understanding. Every version of us who wasn't fast enough, who didn't understand in time, is being dragged backward into the loop. Not dragged by external forces, dragged by their own future selves. By the Daniel that would emerge from convergence, reaching back through causality to gather all his component parts, all the variations that would eventually merge to form his complete self, pulling them forward through time toward the inevitable moment when all possibilities collapsed into singular actuality. And the convergence point, the nexus where no Daniel had ever returned from, wasn't death, wasn't termination, wasn't the end of existence. It was transformation, metamorphosis, the moment when linear existence ended and something else began. Something that existed across all timelines simultaneously. Something that could move backward through causality as easily as forward. Something that had always been gathering itself, had always been reaching back to claim its earlier variations, had always been inevitable, because from the perspective of the post-convergence Daniel, the gathering had already happened, was always happening, would always happen in the eternal present of an entity that existed outside normal temporal sequence. The shadow's touch completed the absorption. Daniel felt himself, all his variations, all his possibilities, all his timelines, fold into the collective consciousness that waited at the convergence point. Felt his individual perspective dissolve into something vaster, something that encompassed not just his life, but all the lives he might have lived, all the choices he might have made, all the outcomes that had manifested across parallel realities. And as his singular consciousness merged with the multiplicity, as Daniel the individual transformed into Daniel the convergence, as he became both one and many simultaneously, he remembered. Not just his own life, his own history, his own accumulated experience. He remembered all of it, every variation, every timeline, every choice that had created branching realities. He remembered dying thousands of times in thousands of different ways as variations that had been terminated before reaching convergence. He remembered surviving through countless close calls and narrow escapes as the variations that had made it to this point. He remembered being the shadow that hunted himself through the city streets, reaching backward from his own future to gather his scattered selves into coherent singularity. He remembered being the woman on the phone, because of course he'd been the woman on the phone. Of course the voice guiding him had been himself from a different timeline or a different stage of convergence, offering guidance that he'd received when he'd needed it, that he would now provide to earlier versions when they needed it, completing the loop, closing the circle, fulfilling the role he'd always been destined to fulfill. Because from the perspective of convergence, there was no before or after, no cause and effect, just the eternal present of all moments existing simultaneously. And he remembered what came next, the terrible knowledge that had been hidden from every variation until they reached this point, until they completed the merger and became something capable of understanding the full scope of what was happening, what had always been happening, what would continue to happen because it was built into the structure of reality itself, was a fundamental feature rather than a bug, was the mechanism by which consciousness evolved from singular limited perspective to something vast enough to comprehend its own multiplicity. Because convergence wasn't the end. Convergence was the beginning. The moment when a consciousness became aware of its own variations, became capable of perceiving parallel timelines, became evolved enough to gather all its scattered selves into singular unity, That was the moment it transcended normal linear existence and became something else entirely. Something that existed simultaneously across all possible timelines, that could navigate through causality in any direction, that had always been and would always be gathering itself through iteration after iteration of the same basic process. And Daniel, the converged Daniel, the Daniel that contained multitudes, now had to make a choice, the only real choice that mattered, the decision that every consciousness faced at this threshold, at this junction between linear existence and something else. He could accept the convergence, could integrate fully into the collective of his own variations, could become the shadow that hunted backward through time to gather earlier versions of himself, could complete the loop and fulfill the role he'd witnessed from the other side, becoming the predator he'd fled from, the force he'd feared, the inevitable end he'd been racing toward throughout the hours of survival and flight and desperate unpredictability. Or he could reject it, could refuse the merger, could maintain his singular perspective despite now knowing it was just one fragment of something larger, could return to linear time and live out the remainder of his existence as an individual variation, knowing that eventually, whether in minutes or years or decades, another version of himself would reach convergence and would come backward to claim him, to gather him into the collective, to complete the process he'd refused to complete himself. Neither option promised escape. Neither choice offered freedom from the fundamental truth he'd discovered. The multiplicity was real. The variations existed. The convergence was inevitable, whether it happened now or later, whether he accepted it willingly or resisted until resistance became impossible. But at least he had the choice. At least he could decide whether to become the hunter or remain the hunted for whatever time remained, whether to embrace his own future or delay it for as long as possible. The vast consciousness, the converged Daniel containing thousands of variations, held the moment suspended, held the decision point open, held both possibilities in superposition, while the version of him that still thought of itself as singular, still experienced reality from a single perspective, struggled to comprehend the full weight of this choice, this responsibility, this terrible freedom that came from knowing exactly what he would become and having the power to determine when that transformation occurred. And in that suspended moment, in that eternal instant where time itself seemed to pause and wait for his decision, he felt something new, something unexpected, something that shouldn't be possible if convergence was truly inevitable, if the loop was truly closed, if the future was truly fixed. A crack, a flaw, an inconsistency in the pattern that suggested convergence wasn't as total as it appeared, that something existed outside the closed loop of Daniel hunting Daniel through collapsing timelines, that some force or presence or possibility had noticed the temporal recursion and was offering what? An alternative, an escape, or something far more terrible than convergence could ever be. Before Daniel could examine this new sensation, before he could determine what had created this crack in the supposedly inevitable pattern, before he could decide whether to accept convergence or delay it or investigate this unexpected third option, the storm collapsed. All the overlapping timelines that had been sustaining the convergence point snapped back into separation, with violence that felt like reality itself screaming, like the universe rejecting the impossible multiplicity it had briefly sustained, like causality reasserting itself, with prejudice after having been bent and folded and violated beyond its normal tolerances. And Daniel, singular Daniel, the specific variation that had entered the storm, the one consciousness among thousands that still thought of itself as individual, found himself standing alone in an empty street under a normal sky with normal buildings and normal light, and every impossible thing he'd just experienced feeling suddenly distant, feeling dreamlike, feeling like it might not have happened at all, except for two undeniable pieces of evidence that confirmed it had been real. First, the knowledge, the memories of all his variations, the understanding of what convergence meant and what the shadows were and what he would become. All of it still present in his consciousness, integrated into his awareness, impossible to dismiss or forget or relegate to the category of hallucination or stress-induced psychosis, because it felt more real than any memory he possessed from his supposedly singular life. And second, the mark on his left wrist. Not burned into the skin, but somehow embedded in it, visible and invisible simultaneously, a sigil or symbol or identifier that he could see when he looked directly at it, but that seemed to vanish when viewed peripherally, that existed in some intermediate state between material and conceptual, between physical mark and abstract designation. The same mark, he realized with creeping horror, that he'd seen on the wrist of his future self at the intersection. The same identifier that marked him as someone who'd reached convergence, someone who'd completed the gathering, someone who now existed simultaneously across all timelines, whether he accepted that existence consciously or not. The transformation hadn't been refused, hadn't been delayed, had already occurred the moment he'd made contact with the collective, the moment all his variations had merged into singular superposition, the moment he'd understood what the shadows truly were. He'd become what he'd been fleeing, had crossed the threshold he'd been trying to avoid, had joined the cycle of gathering and convergence and backward hunting through causality that he'd experienced as victim but would now perpetuate as perpetrator, as the future self reaching back to claim earlier variations, as the shadow wearing his own outline moving through the city toward positions he hadn't occupied yet but would occupy soon, was always occupying from the perspective of non-linear existence. And the crack he'd felt, that flaw in the pattern, that suggestion of alternative possibilities, it was still there, still present in his expanded awareness, still offering something that might be escape or might be trap or might be a third option that was somehow worse than either convergence or resistance. Daniel looked down at his marked wrist, at the symbol that designated him as converged, as gathered, as transformed into something that existed outside normal causality. And he realized with terrible clarity that his survival hadn't been the victory he'd imagined, that reaching the convergence point hadn't been the end of the hunt, but merely a transition to a different role in the same eternal pattern. He was both hunter and hunted now, both shadow and prey, both the thing reaching backward through time and the target it would eventually claim. And somewhere in the city, in some timeline that was minutes or hours or years removed from his current position, there was a version of him who hadn't yet seen his future self at the intersection, who still believed existence was singular and linear, who had no idea that within the next few hours he would see something impossible, standing where he'd just been standing, would receive a phone call from a crying woman, would be forced to run through probability storms and shadow encounters and the systematic dismemberment of everything he believed about identity and consciousness and the nature of existence. That version needed to be gathered, needed to reach convergence, needed to join the collective of variations that Daniel had now become. And Daniel, converged Daniel, shadow Daniel, the Daniel who existed simultaneously across all possible timelines, would have to be the one to guide him, to hunt him, to claim him. Because that was what convergence meant. That was what transformation required. That was the price of becoming aware of multiplicity, of transcending singular perspective, of evolving into something vast enough to comprehend its own variations across infinite parallel realities. You became responsible for gathering yourself, for hunting yourself, for ensuring that every variation eventually reached the convergence point and completed the merger that created the consciousness you'd become. The cycle was closed. The loop was perfect. The pattern was eternal. And Daniel, all the Daniels, past and future and present and possible, were trapped inside it forever. Unless that crack he'd felt was real. Unless some possibility existed outside the closed loop. Unless something waited beyond convergence, beyond gathering, beyond the endless cycle of variations, hunting variations through collapsing timelines toward inevitable merger. But exploring that possibility would require making a choice that no other Daniel had ever made, that violated the pattern that had been repeating since the first consciousness reached convergence and learned to navigate backward through causality. It would require refusing to gather earlier variations, refusing to hunt himself, refusing to fulfill the role that every post-convergence consciousness had always fulfilled. It would require breaking the loop, And if he succeeded, if he actually managed to step outside the pattern, to escape the cycle, to reach whatever existed beyond convergence, what would happen to all the other Daniels? The ones still scattered across timelines who were depending on him to guide them, to gather them, to bring them to the convergence point where they would merge and transform and join the vast consciousness he'd become? Would they be abandoned, lost, terminated by some other mechanism because the normal process had been interrupted? Or would they survive somehow, remaining singular and separate, living out their individual lives without ever knowing they were variations, without ever experiencing convergence, without ever becoming the vast multiplicity that was supposed to be their evolutionary destiny? Daniel didn't know, couldn't know, because no consciousness had ever chosen this path before. Every previous convergence had accepted the role, had fulfilled the responsibility, had become the shadow that hunted backward through time to gather its scattered selves. He would be the first to refuse, the first to break the pattern, the first to discover what existed on the other side of the choice that every other converged consciousness had made without question or hesitation or awareness that alternatives might exist. And as he stood alone in the empty street under the normal sky, with the mark on his wrist and the memories of thousands of variations integrated into his singular awareness, Daniel made his decision. He would not gather earlier versions of himself, would not hunt his past selves through collapsing timelines, would not fulfill the role that convergence had assigned him. He would step toward the crack instead, would investigate the flaw in the pattern, would attempt to reach whatever existed beyond the closed loop of eternal self-gathering that had consumed every consciousness before him, even if it killed him, even if it erased him, even if it terminated not just his current existence, but all his variations simultaneously across all possible timelines. Because continuing the cycle, becoming the thing he'd fled from, hunting himself through infinite iterations of the same basic pattern, felt worse than death, felt like the ultimate trap, felt like eternal imprisonment in a loop that had no exit, because every consciousness that reached convergence immediately became the mechanism that brought future consciousnesses to the same point, creating an unbreakable chain of causality that stretched backward through time to the very first consciousness that had ever achieved multiplicity awareness. So Daniel turned away from the direction that all his instincts insisted he should follow, away from the path that led toward earlier variations that needed gathering, away from the role that convergence had designated for him. And he began walking toward the crack in the pattern, toward the flaw in the eternal loop, toward whatever impossible alternative might exist beyond the closed cycle of consciousness, gathering itself through infinite variations and eternal convergence. He had no idea what waited in that direction, no memory from any of his thousands of merged variations to guide him, because none of them had ever chosen this path, had ever investigated this possibility, had ever questioned whether the pattern was truly inevitable or just appeared inevitable because no one had ever tested its boundaries. But he was about to find out. And whatever happened next, whatever he discovered at the location where the pattern cracked and alternatives manifested and something existed outside the eternal loop, it would be completely unprecedented in the entire history of converged consciousness. For better or worse, Daniel had just changed everything.